Well, our opinion on the book of Hebrews, or the letter to the Hebrews as it should be called, is very divided. Some find it one of the most difficult letters of the New Testament. There are reasons for that. It's a very Jewish letter, and it's really appreciated by Jewish readers, but Gentile readers, it's just a different world of thinking. We just never think about sacrifices and altars and priesthood because we've never had to. And it does need familiarity with the Old Testament scriptures, especially with the book of Leviticus. But that's the book that most people get stuck in when they try and read the Bible right through. These Christians trying to read it right through. Incidentally, we're just doing a series right now called Unlocking the Old Testament. And Leviticus was the one we began with. I was dreading it. But actually it proved the best of the lot. And we just exploded in praise at the end. But you really need to know Leviticus to understand Hebrews. And since most get stuck in Leviticus and don't get through it, Hebrews is also a bit difficult. And it uses arguments that don't really touch the modern mind. Arguments about angels. Well, usually I'm afraid today people joke about arguing about how many angels you can get on the head of a pin and things like this. And that kind of argument doesn't click with us. The Greek of Hebrews is very complicated. In fact, it's the best Greek of the New Testament. It's nearer to classical Greek. You may not know it, but the New Testament was not written in classical Greek. That was the Greek spoke by scholars and professors. It was written in what's called Koine Greek. We would call it Cockney Greek. And it's interesting that God wanted his word in the language of the street and not the language of the university. But Hebrews is jolly good Greek, and it gets nearer to the classical language than any of the other. And even in English, the language is fairly refined and fairly sophisticated. So there are many reasons why people do find it a difficult book. Some people you talk to say, oh, this is the most delightful book of all. And they just love it and they revel in it. Usually for one of three reasons. One is for that magnificent chapter on faith. Everybody knows Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Moses, by faith, Abraham, by faith, Noah, and all that. It's like a Westminster Abbey. You know, you go walking around Westminster Abbey looking at all the famous people, and it's just like taking a walk through a mausoleum like that and looking back into the past, seeing these great heroes of faith. So it's a good epistle on faith, and most people feel somewhat relieved to get to chapter 11 and say, I understand this bit, and this registers with me. Others find it a very helpful book on the whole question of how the Old Testament and the New Testament relate. And indeed it tells you what to do with the law of Moses. It's very clever in the way it unfolds the relationship of our Christian faith to all the ritual of the temple in the old days. And then others love it because of what it tells us about Christ. Those who love Jesus love Hebrews, because it really does throw a new light on him that no other writer of the New Testament does. The favorite word that he uses is the word better. And if you've read that, or superior in some versions, but the word better is a key word, and it comes all the way through. Jesus is better. Jesus is better. Jesus is better. And he doesn't say best, though that is true, because he's making a comparison all the time. Jesus is better than the angels, better than the prophets, better than all these others. He's better. But why should he write a letter to show that Jesus is better than everyone else? Well, now, both these opinions, that it's a difficult book or a delightful book, are really both extreme opinions, and both of them miss the main point of the letter. And the real key to Hebrews is, why was it written? And though it's a little complicated to find the answer, once you've found it, the whole letter opens up. Until you know that answer, frankly, it's a mixture. And there are parts of the letter that don't seem to fit, and other parts, and it doesn't hang together. But once you've got that key, everything in it makes sense. Just every sentence fits that key. So let's try and find the key. Why was it written? What was the purpose, the aim, the objective? And the first problem we have is that we know very little about the background of it. We don't even know who wrote it. One great scholar called this the riddle of the New Testament. We don't like riddles, like to know the answers to riddles. Well, who wrote it? I haven't a clue. There have been all sorts of guesses. Some old authorized King James versions used to say the Epistle of Paul to the Hebrews. That was sheer guesswork. I don't think Paul wrote it. It's not his style. It's not his language. It just doesn't fit. Others have said it might be Barnabas. Another candidate is Stephen, or Silas, or Apollos. One suggestion is that it was Priscilla, but because it was a woman writing, she thought she'd better not have put her name to it. That's a kind of modern reading back, I think, into it. And ultimately, I have to say, with the great Christian Origen of Alexandria, God alone knows. So that's not going to help us. We don't know who wrote it. So can we come from another angle and say, well, where was it sent to? And here again, there's nothing in the letter that says to the saints in such and such a place. There's no address on it, except just to the Hebrews. So where is it sent to? There is one clue, however. There have been many suggestions. It was sent to Alexandria, to Antioch, to Jerusalem, to Ephesus. But there is one clue right at the end. The writer says, everyone from Italy sends greetings. And from that, I think it's a sensible deduction to say it was sent to Italy. If you say everybody from Italy sends their love, then surely you're writing to Italy. And at that time, surely it must be again the church in Rome, the one we were talking about in the letter to the Romans. And yet, clearly, it's a bit later, because certain things have happened which hadn't happened when Paul wrote to Rome. So I'm assuming it's to the Christians in Rome, and to that half of the church that was the Jewish half. It's clearly to Christian believers, and yet it's addressed to Hebrews. So here is a clue. It is addressed or sent to the Jewish half of the church in Rome. Now, why would a letter be needed for half the church? Well, let's feel our way into it a little further. Clearly, the first leaders of the church have died. That indicates that it's a bit later, because the writer says, remember your leaders. Just bring them back to mind, the first ones who led you. And so they're already dead and gone. So that's a generation gone. So it is a bit later. And yet we can say a later date for it, because clearly the temple and its sacrifices are still going, because he talks about them and not in the past tense. So clearly it's before AD 70 when the temple was destroyed and sacrifices ceased. So this is the kind of detective work that begins to narrow it down, at least in time. So it was after Paul wrote to Rome and before AD 70. What happened in between there? And the answer is, a man came to the imperial throne called Nero. And now we begin to understand a bit of the background. Nero, like Hitler, did a lot of good things in the beginning. If you read the life of Hitler, you'll find that he saved Germany from unemployment and from inflation. He built the autobahns, the great roads. He it was who ordered the Volkswagen Beetle as a people's car. That's what Volkswagen means. And he did a number of good things for Germany in the beginning. That's why people followed him.